I never thought parking in my own driveway would turn into a full-blown neighborhood war. But here we are. It started as a simple decision, closing off my driveway for a few days while I got some renovations done. Next thing I knew, the HOA was up in arms, sending me threats, slapping me with fines, and, get this, calling the cops on me like I was some kind of criminal. You won't believe how far they went to make my life miserable. My trouble with the HOA started the moment I decided to temporarily block my driveway. I had a crew coming in to redo the concrete, and I didn't want anyone using it while the work was in progress. Simple, right? Apparently not. The first issue came up within hours. A letter appeared on my door. Yes, they didn't even knock, stating that I was in violation of some obscure HOA rule about unauthorized alterations. I laughed it off at first. What were they going to do? Fine me for fixing my own driveway? Turns out, that's exactly what they tried to do. By the next morning, another letter arrived. This one demanded that I remove the barriers immediately, or face a fine of $100 per day. That's when I knew they were serious. But here's the thing, I wasn't about to back down. My driveway, my rules. I decided to ignore them. The construction crew came, started tearing up the old concrete, and the project was moving along just fine. But then, the HOA president herself showed up. She was fuming, said I was causing an eyesore and disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. I told her the work would be done in a few days. She didn't care. She handed me a notice saying I had 24 hours to comply, or further action would be taken. What do you think I did? Yep, I ignored it again. That's when things escalated. Next morning, the police showed up. I kid you not. 2 officers standing on my doorstep, looking dead serious. One of them asked if I was aware that I was violating HOA regulations. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The cops were being dragged into a dispute about my own driveway? I explained everything, how it was temporary, how I had a legal right to do construction on my own property. The officers looked at each other, clearly realizing how ridiculous this was. One of them even muttered, "They really called us for this?" But here's the kicker. While the cops were polite, they said they had to respond because the HOA filed an official complaint, claiming I was obstructing a community pathway. A complete lie. At this point, I was fuming. But it wasn't over yet. As the officers left, the HOA president stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, with this smug little smirk. "You're making this harder on yourself," she said. Oh, I knew what she was doing. This wasn't about my driveway anymore. This was personal. And let me tell you, I wasn't going to let them win. I thought that after the cops left, things would calm down. Maybe the HOA would realize how ridiculous they were being. But nope, they doubled down. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my garage door. This one wasn't just a warning, it was a final notice. According to them, I owed $700 in fines for obstructing community access, failing to comply with HOA directives, and creating a public nuisance. A nuisance? My own driveway? Now they were just making things up. I was furious. But the real kicker came when my contractor showed up. He looked at me, confused, and said, "Hey, you know your permit's been revoked, right?" My what? Ran inside, pulled up the city's website, and sure enough, my construction permit had been canceled. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint with the city, claiming that my driveway work was violating zoning laws. I knew exactly who was behind it. The HOA president wanted to shut me down completely. At this point, I had 2 options. I could cave, pay the fines, and let them win, or I could fight back. And if you've been following along, you already know what I chose. First, I called the city and got a copy of the complaint. Sure enough, it was filed by someone from the HOA board. But here's the thing. The complaint was bogus. They claimed I was expanding my driveway without approval, which was a total lie. I wasn't expanding anything, just replacing what was already there. Armed with that info, I filed an appeal with the city, arguing that the HOA was abusing its power. It would take a few days to process, but I was confident they'd see through the nonsense. But the HOA wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I heard a loud clank outside. I ran out and nearly lost my mind. They had towed my car. Apparently, since my driveway was under construction, they claimed I was in violation of street parking restrictions. Never mind that plenty of my neighbors parked on the street all the time. This was targeted. I stormed over to the HOA office, demanding to speak to the president. The receptionist looked uncomfortable but finally admitted, "She's the one who ordered it." Oh, this wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about power. I could feel my blood boiling. If they thought I was just going to roll over and let them push me around, they had another thing coming. This was war. At this point, I knew the HOA was out to get me. But what I didn't know was why. Sure, they loved their little power trips, but this level of aggression, it didn't make sense. I wasn't just dealing with a petty HOA president. I was dealing with someone who was desperate to shut me down. So, I started digging. First, I went through the HOA bylaws, looking for any rule that actually supported their claims. Nothing. There wasn't a single mention of temporary driveway work requiring approval. The street parking violation they used to tow my car? Also fake. Other residents had done the same thing with no issues. That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting a bad rule, I was fighting a setup. I needed proof. I started talking to my neighbors, asking if anyone else had dealt with suspicious HOA fines. That's when I found out something interesting. I wasn't the first target. An older couple down the street told me they had been fined thousands for unapproved landscaping. Another guy mentioned he got fined for having a basketball hoop, even though 3 other houses had the same thing. Then came the real bombshell. One neighbor, let's call him Mike, pulled me aside and said, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there's a reason they're coming after you." I listened as he explained. Apparently, the HOA president had a deal with a local contractor. Every time a homeowner was fined for violations, they were pressured into hiring this specific company to fix the issue. And guess what? That company just happened to be owned by her brother-in-law. That's when everything clicked. The fines, the threats, the permit being pulled. It was all a scam. The HOA was targeting homeowners, creating fake violations, and forcing them to pay up. And if someone resisted, they turned up the pressure. I was just the latest victim. But they made one big mistake. They picked the wrong guy to mess with. Armed with this new information, I started gathering evidence. I got copies of my fines, my revoked permit, and testimonies from neighbors who had been forced to pay up. Then, I did something they never expected. I went straight to the local news. Within an hour, I was on the phone with an investigative reporter who was very interested in a story about HOA corruption. He asked for documents, recordings, anything that could prove what was going on. Oh, I had plenty. The HOA wanted a fight? They were about to get one. The next morning, everything exploded. The local news didn't waste time. They ran the story that same night. It had everything: shady HOA fines, a corrupt president, and homeowners being bullied into paying thousands for bogus violations. They even interviewed some of my neighbors on camera, and let me tell you, the reaction was glorious. By noon, the HOA office was in chaos. Residents were furious, demanding refunds, asking for emergency meetings. My phone was blowing up with messages, people thanking me, sharing their own horror stories. Turns out, nearly half the neighborhood had been hit with unfair fines. But the best part? The exposure worked faster than I expected. By the afternoon, I got a call from the city. Remember how they pulled my permit? Well, after the news aired, someone from the permit office decided to take a second look. Not only did they reinstate my permit, but they also launched an investigation into the HOA. Oh, and the cops? Yeah, they weren't too happy either. Turns out, misusing law enforcement for personal vendettas is something they take seriously. An officer showed up at the HOA office asking a few very pointed questions about why they wasted police resources on a completely legal home project. And then came the final blow. That evening, the HOA called for an urgent board meeting. But here's the thing. After the news report, nobody was scared of them anymore. The residents packed the place, demanding answers. The president tried to talk her way out of it, blaming miscommunication and claiming everything was done by the book. But then Mike, the same neighbor who tipped me off, stood up and said, "So? Does that mean your brother-in-law isn't getting kickbacks from all these fines?" Boom. Silence. She turned pale. She knew it was over. By the end of the night, the board members voted her out. She tried to argue, threatened to sue, but at that point, no one cared. Her own people turned on her, calling for a full financial audit. It was beautiful. And just like that, the war was over. The next day, my driveway construction resumed without a hitch. No more fines, no more threats, just peace and quiet. Exactly how it should have been from the start. I stood there, watching the crew pour the new concrete, feeling a sense of victory. The HOA thought they could bully me. They thought they could cheat the system. They thought wrong. You know what the best part of all this was? Watching the HOA crumble from the inside. After the president was kicked out, things moved fast. The new board wanted to distance themselves from her mess, so they launched a full audit of the HOA's finances. And guess what they found? Missing money. Lots of it. Turns out, she wasn't just running a scam with the contractor, she had also been pocketing fines from homeowners. Thousands of dollars had mysteriously disappeared over the past few years. When the residents found out, lawsuits started flying. Oh, and remember how she called the cops on me? Yeah, that backfired spectacularly. The police launched an official investigation into her misuse of emergency services. Apparently, calling the cops under false pretenses isn't something they take lightly. Last I heard, she was facing charges for filing a fraudulent report. But here's where it gets really good. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the new HOA board. At first, I thought, oh great, what now? But when I opened it, it was a formal apology. Not only did they void every fine I had received, but they also reimbursed me for my towing fees. They even offered to cover part of my driveway renovation, costs as a way to make up for everything. Now, I could have held a grudge. I could have fought for more. But honestly, I didn't need to. I had already won. A month later, things in the neighborhood felt different. People weren't afraid of the HOA anymore. The new board actually listened to residents instead of trying to control them. Rules were relaxed, ridiculous fines stopped, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a community again. And the ex-president? She moved out. No one knows exactly where she went. But rumor has it, she had to sell her house to pay for legal fees. Poetic justice at its finest. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my brand new driveway without anyone breathing down my neck. No more threats. No more nonsense. Just me, standing there, knowing that I had fought back and won. So, to anyone dealing with an HOA nightmare, don't back down. They rely on fear to control people, but the moment you push back, that's when they fall apart. Trust me, I've been there, and I came out on top.